In 1987, a mass uprising took place in South Korea which overthrew the brutal US-backed dictatorship. Soon after, workers launched what became known as the Great Workers' Struggle, a mass strike which helped transform the country for working class and poor people. This is working class history. Our podcast is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Our supporters fund our work and in return get exclusive early access to podcast episodes, ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, free and discounted merch, and other content. For example, our supporters can listen to both parts of this double episode now. We've been working on these episodes on and off since 2021, and it's only because of your support that we're able to devote the amount of time and resources that we do producing episodes like this. You can join us and find out more at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. As a content note, this episode contains a brief mention of sexual violence. Now, we're not going to go into too much detail about the background to this movement because we cover this in a lot of detail in our previous episodes. In episode 51, we talk about the period from World War II up to the end of the 70s, and in episodes 53 to 56, we cover the 1980s and in particular the Gwangju Uprising of 1980, which was the most significant pro-democratic rebellion in the country prior to 1987. But in short, for most of the time since the end of World War II, South Korea was ruled by a succession of violent and repressive dictatorships, all propped up by the United States, where workers toiled long hours for low pay and any resistance was brutally crushed, as it was in Gwangju.
제가 그러니까 1980년 광주 항쟁이 일어났을 때
In 1980, when the Gwangju Uprising occurred, I was in the first year of middle school. At that time, my older sister and brother were university students.
This is Hong Seung-ha, who was born in Seoul and whom I met with there last year. Her words are translated and dubbed by Hwang Jeongeun of the International Strategy Center, to whom we're extremely grateful for interpreting for us during our interview, and we'd also like to thank Kwon Beomchul, who connected us with Hong and helped translate questions. Thanks also to our Patreon supporters who make all of our work like this possible.
그래서 그 80년 상황을 어렸지만
Although I was young, I could understand a bit about the situation in Gwangju in 1980. During that time, information about Gwangju was not covered by the media at all. However, I heard about the Gwangju situation from my sister and brother. From what I remember, there was extensive coverage of the Gwangju Uprising in a magazine called 신동아 when I was in high school. I vividly read about the Gwangju Uprising in that magazine and was very surprised. Learning about the truth played an important role in my teenage period. That's when my perspective on society began to develop around high school.
Hong's siblings were both older than her and already at university. A few years later, Hong herself enrolled in university to study architectural engineering.
그리고 그러니까 그 부모님이 그러니까 그때 당시 한국 사회는 그러니까
At that time in Korean society, parents had various concerns about their children getting involved in student activism once they entered university. Consequently, they worried about what would happen if the children participated in student movements. Fearing that their children might engage in student activism, they prevented their children from doing so. However, I had prior exposure to such experiences through my sister and brother. Although my sister and brother didn't participate in student activism, they still attended events like gatherings, despite my parents' opposition. So I felt that I could easily engage in such activities right from the start.
Parents were justified in being afraid for their children because the dictatorship of Chun Do-won was extremely repressive and violent, especially against any sort of left, progressive, or democratic movements.
그리고 그걸 탄압했던 게 유신 정권이었고.
There were social progressive movements risking their lives. much like during the independence movement under the Japanese colonial era, up until the 1970s. Even in the 1980s, police could enter universities and even classrooms, arresting students. This was the atmosphere when I entered university in 1986. When I joined the club in college, we used pseudonyms. Even in the officially established singing club, where I became a member, we used pseudonyms.
Sexism was also prevalent at the time, both from the state and broader society.
그런 어떤 남녀의 성차별 이런 것들은 늘 너무
During that time, gender discrimination was prevalent, and I even experienced sexual harassment when I entered university. There were many instances where men belittled women. Even in the 1980s, there was almost no perspective viewed through a gender lens. Therefore, although gender discrimination occurred frequently in daily life, it was not a major issue. At that time, there were cases where if women smoked in cafe or on the street, men would come up and slap them. So it was hard for women to smoke outside. However, the oppression by the military dictatorship was overwhelming compared to the issue of gender discrimination. Gender movements were not widespread at the time.
So while there wasn't much of a feminist movement to speak of, there was a sizable underground student movement against the dictatorship.
사실 젠더 운동 이런 게 일어나지 않았었어요. 그때 당에.
Many people, including myself, who became university students under the military dictatorship, had to contemplate the crucial decision of whether to engage in student activism or not. Initially, I decided not to participate and began preparing for the civil service exam. At that time, students who entered university were sent to the military training ground. And in their second year, they were forced to participate in frontline military exercise. As a result, students initiated a struggle against the frontline military exercises. And during this process, Kim Se-jin and Lee Jae-ho, who were students at Seoul National University, self-immolated. The self-immolation of Kim Se-jin and Lee Jae-ho had a decisive impact on me, prompting me to quit my civil service exam preparations and join the struggle on the street.
Self-immolation protests had a recent history in South Korea, going back to Chun Tae-il, a garment worker organizer who set himself on fire in 1970, and is the main subject of our podcast episode 51. The student movement wasn't immune to the sexism of wider society, but for Hwang and other women activists at the time, they had bigger concerns.
그러니까 그게 이제 사회 현상이니까 밖에 나가서 담배 못 펴요, 여자들이.
Within the student movement, I think there was more emphasis on something other than gender discrimination. When you went out on the streets, you could get caught. And if you were caught, you had to give up a lot in your life, choosing that kind of life. I think those urgencies were even greater than gender issues.
One issue which did come up was that many student activist groups had a ban on romantic relationships within them.
연애 못 하겠어요.
What was interesting was that the seniors prevented us from dating. I was dating at the time, so I received a lot of criticism for it. I received criticism, but I ignored it and continued to date. At that time, the criticism was about how I could date during such a harsh period, and it was argued that the movement should be the top priority.
But Hwang, along with many others, decided that involvement in activism didn't mean putting your personal life on hold.
인천시에 있는 강화군이라는 작은 섬.
I grew up on an island called Changhwa in the Incheon region. I first started working in 1978. Came down to Busan to work at a hanbok factory. Then I worked at another factory making men's shirts.
This is Kim Jin-sook, whose words here have been translated and dubbed by Angela Lee, and was working in garment factories at this time. Thanks to Hwang Yi-ra for conducting this interview for us, and to Kap Su Seol for connecting us and making it happen.
시다발이라고 일본 말이기는 한데
At the hanbok factory called Shidabari, I worked stamping the gold and silver foil onto the fabric. At the clothing factory, I sewed and cleaned chalk marks off of the garments with wet toothbrushes.
Pay and working conditions in South Korea were terrible. The average hourly wage was about $1.75, compared with over $13 in the US. The average working week was also 57 hours, one of the longest in the world. Genuine workers' organizations were illegal under the dictatorship. Instead, they were just pliant, corrupt, company, quote, unions.
그때는 어용노조였어요, 노조가. 사측의 입맛대로 사측의
In 1986, there were fishermen's unions and other quote-unquote unions. But these unions aligned with the taste of the companies. These false unions did what the companies asked to do, what they commanded, and those types of unions were not needed, nor did they help. So other than the workers' demands regarding the company or regarding the government, the main direct demands was about these fake unions themselves. It was found that the corporations used member dues to drink and party, to use as personal funds, and the workers' fury only increased.
Workers who actually tried to fight for their own interests quickly came into conflict both with employers and the state.
그런 것들을 조합원들에게 알리고 조합원들의
And this is the time people were being arrested, taken away, and tortured. They withheld work from us. They separated us, moved us to different locations, and many were fired. The oppression didn't come from business, the bosses, or a corporation. The government powers are the ones who enacted the oppression of the workers. So if I went on strike, the police are the ones who came to beat us, arrest us, and create blockades, restrict our movement. It was state violence.
Kim had got a job at a shipyard and was the first woman welder in South Korea. While she was attempting to organize there, Hwang had begun to get active at university.
Then I started engaging in club activities and student activism, devoting myself entirely to it. I spent 1986 immersed in daily struggles on the street and seminars on social issues. I remember vividly the first day I participated in the street protest in 1986. It was so frightening. A senior suggested we go somewhere, and I waited nervously until the senior signaled to join the protest. I still remember the fear I felt back then. Once that fear broke, I wasn't afraid anymore from then on. As you may know, there were many significant events in 1986, but 1987 also witnessed a multitude of events. The Chun Doo-hwan regime intensified its oppression with great power. In 1986, there was the incident at Konkuk University, and in 1987, there were numerous fabricated spy cases.
The fake spy cases were a consequence of the division of Korea into the north, backed by the Soviet Union, and the south, backed by the United States.
After the independence and the Korean War, the Korean peninsula was divided between the north and the south. The period around the 1950s and 1960s was marked by North Korea sending spies to the south with the aim of achieving North-South reunification.
With the background of the Cold War, left-wing and progressive ideas in the south were, and to an extent still are, conflated with pro-North Korean sentiment and espionage.
87년이 되면서는 87년은
One notable incident was the death of Park Jeong-chul due to torture.
Park Jeong-chul was a linguistics student who was arrested by police for protesting against the government. He was interrogated, tortured and waterboarded, which killed him in January 1987. In early February, this led to the biggest protests in South Korea in years, organized by students, church groups and workers' organizations. Tens of thousands of people took to the streets in at least 17 cities around the country. In Seoul, 20,000 demonstrators faced off against 30,000 riot police, and clashes took place as police fired tear gas and protesters threw rocks and petrol bombs. Police detained over 1,000 people and put other known activists under house arrest.
저는 86년도에 해고됐었고
I was laid off in 1986. And in 1987, there was the Yugor Hangjang, or the Struggle of June. That was sparked by Pak Jong-chul, a college student who had lost his life after being tortured in the Taegong Bunshil, which is a building where activists were held and tortured. In 86, just 8 months before Pak Jong-chul had met his fate, I experienced the same torture in that same building. But I had all this guilt that I had made out of the torture room alive. Pak Jong-chul was held just across the hall from me. He came up in the same region as me. He was tortured in the same space as I. But I escaped with my life, and he lost his. This caused me such great pain and guilt. So I fought as hard as I could during the June struggle.
민족해방, 애국, 하여튼 이러면 제가
Various fabricated spy cases occurred within the major activist faction. So, even after the Pak Jong-chul torture death incident, the Chun Doo-hwan regime continued its oppression with confidence, thinking it could transfer power through a military dictatorship.
Grassroots support was growing for amending South Korea's constitution to mandate direct presidential elections, as opposed to the indirect ones which were in place at the time. Under this system, lawmakers in the National Conference for Unification elected the president. But the existing constitution did ban presidents from holding power for more than 7 years, a time period which was due to expire for Chun in 1987.
그래서 그 전에 개헌 논의가 이미 됐었음에도
Therefore,
불구하고
despite ongoing discussions about constitutional amendments, the Chun Doo-hwan regime announced a decree to protect the constitution that virtually nullified the constitutional discussions on April 13.
On the 13th of April 1987, Chun Doo-hwan officially announced that the constitution would remain unchanged. However, his plan was to appoint one of his supporters to succeed him. This provoked huge public anger. Meanwhile, attempts by authorities to cover up the murder of Pak Jong-chul eventually failed. On the 18th of May, at a memorial mass commemorating the Gwangju Uprising of 1980, a priest, a member of the National Catholic Priests Association for Justice, revealed the truth, that Pak was tortured to death. This sparked a massive outcry.
박종철 열사가 1월 달에 돌아가시고
Pak Jong-chul had passed away in January. People understood the significance of his death. The Chun Doo-hwan administration had lied about the cause of death, that he just keeled over and died on the table. But at the time, those few who had experienced the torture room knew what had gone on in that building. So eventually the nation came to understand that torture was the cause of Pak Jong-chul's death. So after hearing of Pak Jong-chul's death, knowing that he died by torture, we fought. We demonstrated, we protested, and we marched. We fought to oust the lies and the manipulation of the press, and the fight continued.
그해 봄부터 그러니까 날마다 거리에
From
나갔어요.
spring 1987, I went out to the streets every day. First, I went to school early in the morning. Initially, we had classes at school, but later there were no classes. When I went to school, I went to the classroom and persuaded my classmates to go out to the streets by explaining the situation at the time. And then we went out to the streets. After the protest, we went back to school, shared and discussed the day's situation. We repeated this every day. That's what we did. After the college stopped classes, I played a role in ensuring that students could come out to school.
Mass protests were planned against the murder of Pak for the 10th of June, the day that the ruling party planned to announce that Chun Doo-hwan's successor would be Roh Tae-woo, the second most powerful figure in the dictatorship and the founder of the intelligence service, the KCIA. On the 9th of June, as student activists prepared for the protests the following day, the next key event happened which would cause the situation to escalate to another level.
6월 9일 이한열 열사.
On June 9,
그 체류탄 맞았어.
the historic incident occurred where Lee Han-yeol, a student activist, was fatally hit by a tear gas canister and died. Right after that, the June 10 democratic movement took place. This marked the peak of the democratization movement in 1987.
Lee Han-yeol was a student at Yonsei University who was shot in the head with a tear gas canister and put in a coma by the police in an incident which spurred even bigger support for the movement. Bring back Lee Han-yeol became a popular slogan. Desperate to try to stop the planned protests on the 10th of June, the day before, authorities rounded up thousands of known activists and put hundreds of opposition leaders under house arrest. But this failed to stop the protests. On the 10th of June, the day after Lee was injured, Hwang was one of those who took to the streets.
6월 60에도
On June 10th, I was also near Seoul City Hall in the Uljido area. At that time, the police arrested the leaders of the protest. So the police took a lot of pictures and arrested all the leaders. The detained leaders were sent to jail. Usually, senior students in their fourth year of university became the leaders. When the protest began, seniors would take the megaphone and start agitating, and the people would gather after dispersing. We protested in that way.
In 2017, a film developed by Chang Jun-won came out called 1987, When the Day Comes, which is about the June Democratic Uprising. Hwang says that its depiction of the protests and what it was like on the streets during that time is pretty accurate, so if you want to get a feel for how it felt, you should check it out. Protests took place in at least 18 cities all over South Korea. Police attacked demonstrators and used copious amounts of tear gas. In Masan, an international football match between South Korea and Egypt had to be suspended because players couldn't play in the clouds of tear gas hanging over the pitch. In some places, protesters got the better of police, burning down police boxes, and in one incident, a group of officers was captured and stripped of their helmets and uniforms, which were then thrown into a fountain. Demonstrators had called on motorists in Seoul to honk their horns to indicate their support for the protests that evening. The New York Times reported that, quote, for 25 minutes, cars honked and beeped their way across City Hall Plaza, reaching a crescendo in one 5-minute period when almost every driver seemed to have a hand pressed to the horn. End quote. To look after each other and stay safe on the demonstration, Hwang and her comrades made plans for how to stay connected no matter how hectic things became.
그렇게 해서 이제 어느 거리에 가자.
We had agreed in advance where to disperse. We waited, and when the seniors started agitating, we gathered together to form the protest. At that time, there were many people around Seoul City Hall and Uljido. After the protest, we often lost our shoes. I remember on June 10th, there were piles of shoes everywhere. The police fired tear gas to disperse the protesters. Then the protest groups scattered and fled to nearby alleys or streets. Some even sought refuge in nearby shops. There were shopkeepers who let us in such situations.
In Busan, tens of thousands of people took to the streets chanting, "Overthrow the dictatorship." And in Seongnam, 30,000 people rallied. In Daegu, 20,000 people took to the streets. Some demonstrators were arrested and placed on a bus, but the crowd stoned the bus and rescued those detained. The strength of public feeling was so strong that people started losing their fear, and everyone started to get involved, including those who'd previously been reluctant to engage in student activism. One of Hwang's fondest memories is of how, eventually, the distinction between activists and her friends and everyone else was essentially erased, as the movement had become so big.
그리고 87년에 이제
In 1987, many friends from college didn't join at first. But when the June uprising began, almost all the students went out to the streets. So after the protest was over, having a drink of makgeolli together felt really good at the time.
Makgeolli is a delicious Korean unfiltered rice wine, which is cloudy, slightly fizzy, and is typically about as alcoholic as a strong Belgian beer, so about 6 to 9%. Elsewhere in Seoul, hundreds of protesters tried to avoid the police crackdown by seeking refuge in the Myeongdong Cathedral. Police surrounded it, waiting to arrest those inside, so the 760 people who'd been surrounded launched a sit-in. Although the occupiers were criticised by the official democratic opposition, the National Movement Headquarters for the Achievement of a Democratic Constitution, They were supported by the Catholic community, local office workers, and students at the local girls' school who brought them lunchboxes and supportive messages. Eventually, the government offered the occupiers amnesty to leave, and the cathedral was vacated by the 15th of June. The success of the cathedral occupiers further emboldened the movement, and protests continued. A demonstration against police violence, and in particular the use of tear gas, was organised for the 18th of June. Rallies took place in nearly 250 locations in 16 cities, and according to the New York Times, riot police, quote, lost control of the streets, end quote. After this, Chun Do-won came close to calling in the army, but ultimately decided against it. While there were large numbers of students on the streets, and the June Democratic Movement is primarily referred to as a student movement, Kim believes that the role of the working class in the struggle has been widely underestimated or even airbrushed out.
일반적으로 한국에서는
In Korea, the June struggle of 87 was led by the 386 generation. That means that college students were key in the leadership of the struggle. But as a direct participant, I'd like to challenge that idea.
The 386 generation in South Korea refers to the generation of people born in the 1960s, so equivalent to younger baby boomers and elder Generation X members in the US or UK. The name of the generation comes from the 386 Intel computer, which was the one mostly in use in the 1990s when the term was coined.
저는 직접 현장에 참가했던 사람으로서
Yes, there were plenty of students who were there. Student protesters could fall under the flags of student organizations and groups. But this was a time prior to the idea or concept of a democratic union. There were no flags, no organizations that workers could gather under. So I'd have to argue that there was a strong, perhaps bigger population of workers within the struggle of June. The biggest change was when workers were on the streets directly fighting with the authorities. They were being taken away, being hit by tear gas, but there was no fear.
This prioritization of students in historical narratives at the expense of workers is something which is very common. For example, similar whitewashing occurs with the Tiananmen Square uprising in China, which had a very significant working class component which is usually ignored. The same goes for the May 68 events in France. The most significant aspect of this movement was a general strike with factory occupations by 10 million workers, but these are normally ignored in favour of student protests. We're actually working on a podcast mini-series about May 68 at the moment, so watch out for that in the future.
노동자들이 사실은 가장 큰 희생자였죠.
The greatest sacrifice was made by the workers. All those who participated in the citizens' movement suffered. The students, the people, but especially the workers and laborers. Workers were not able to receive pay. All of the demands were getting heated and they were not able to change. And the first thing that the Chun Do-hwan administration did was to oppress the workers. All of the rebels, the activists, union organizers were taken away and manipulated. The media painted them as vigilantes, rebels, as 빨갱이s, which are reddies or commies. There was an absolute government ban on all union organizing. It was a difficult time for workers. The lives of workers were tenuous, and there were no means for them to make any kind of living.
In addition to factory workers and labourers, even significant numbers of white-collar workers began joining the protests. For example, in Seoul, lots of workers in banks and financial services started joining protests during their lunch breaks. White-collar workers around the country also started forming underground unions. Because of the harsh dictatorship, students also had to organise covertly.
그 당시에 학생운동도 비합법조직.
At that time, the student movement against the dictatorship also operates as an underground organizations. So publicly, most students were involved in club activities, but they were actually part of the illegal organizations. They chose this way because if they didn't, they would face oppression. In that year as well, there were major fabricated spy cases involving PD-related representative organizations.
The PD here was the New Korean Democratic Party, a liberal, centrist or centre-right democratic opposition party at this time.
PD 계열의 대표 조직인 CA와 그다음에
Many prominent figures in the movement at the time were arrested. I attended a predominantly male-dominated engineering college with very few female students. So, in fact, I received a lot of protection. Usually, by the time male students and seniors reached the fourth year, they all got arrested at the time. I was among the last generation to experience this period.
However, Hwang was only able to avoid arrest for so long.
그래서 87년에 제가
I was once detained in Suwon in 1987. It was when I went on an expedition protest to another school. The police raided the bus. When the police raided the bus, the male seniors all escaped through the bus windows, but I couldn't run away, so I was caught at that moment. Usually when the police fired tear gas, you could flee on the street, and the police often beat up male students or detained them. So even when I stopped running away, the police didn't catch me.
Thankfully, Hwang didn't suffer any serious legal consequences.
경찰서 가서 조서 쓰고 그러니까 학년도 어렵고
At that time, I was asked some questions to write a report at the police station. Then I was let go. Since I was only a sophomore at the time, and there needed to be substantial evidence of being a leader, which wasn't present. Typically, leaders were seniors in the fourth grade, and usually the first, second, and third grades were protected. Furthermore, I think I didn't take a forefront position because I was a female student.
Being a woman sometimes meant that the police's sexist assumptions that women couldn't be leading organisers constituted a layer of protection for women activists. But it also added a significant danger.
그러니까 그 당시에 그 여성들이
At that time, when women were sent to prison, they often faced sexual assault. The case of Kwon In-sook's sexual assault is well known worldwide. Women faced a lot of that kind of oppression.
Kwon In-sook was a 21-year-old student who dropped out of university and began working and organising in factories. She was arrested in June 1986 for participating in the protests and sexually assaulted during her police interrogation. Her attacker was convicted and jailed for 5 years in 1988. The police also used arrests as an opportunity to gather intelligence and put pressure on protesters.
엄청 많이 찍혔을 거예요, 저도. 그래서 그건 알고 있어요.
The police took a lot of pictures of people at the protest site. At that time, the seniors who were in charge of the student union exchanged information with the police who were in charge. When they met the police showed them the pictures of almost everyone who participated in the protest. At that time, I was also an executive member of the student union and president of a club, so the police must have kept a close eye on me. I don't remember exactly if it was in my second or third year of college, but I remember receiving a persuasion letter from the police. The letter said, "Your parents are worried, and you have a lot of talent. Why are you living like that? Shouldn't you study and live a successful life?"
In addition to uniformed police on the streets, the government also used plainclothes undercover officers to infiltrate the movement.
그리고 그러니까 그 프락치들을
And the police had undercover agents a lot. So among the comrades who were participating in student movements, there were people suspected of being undercover agents. Because many cases were not clearly revealed, we still debate when we meet, saying that person was an undercover agent. There were grounds for suspicion, but it couldn't be proven. The undercover agents actually existed, and it's unfortunate that there was a possibility that a friend who was fighting alongside us might have been an undercover agent.
Despite all the repression, the government was unable to stop the growth of the movement. The government discussed using the army to crush the protests, as they did in Gwangju in 1980, and one diplomat said they came very close to doing so. There were likely several contributing factors to this decision. Firstly, figures within the government had warned Chun that using the army might jeopardize the planned Olympic Games scheduled for the following year in Seoul. Secondly, many military commanders did not want to be used to repress their own population, especially given the unpopularity of the decisions to do so previously. Another factor was likely the scale of the protests. Unlike previous uprisings, which were confined to particular regions, like Gwangju or Busan and Masan, this movement was across the whole country. Finally, the government likely feared that if they did send troops against their own people, soldiers might mutiny, as they did in 1960 when the dictatorship of Syngman Rhee collapsed. Alternatively, it might spark their overthrow in a violent revolution which could get completely out of control. So instead, a government minister went on TV and threatened that general, quote, extraordinary, end quote, measures would be taken if protests didn't stop. But they didn't stop. And in the end, after 2.5 weeks of upheaval, on the 29th of June, there was only one extraordinary measure left for the government to take.
전두환 다음에 2인자, 노태우가 6.29 선언을
The main figure of the military regime, No Tae-woo, announced the June 29th declaration. After Chun Do-hwan, the second in command, No Tae-woo announced the June 29th declaration, and we call it Deceptive Declaration. The June 29th declaration was about implementing direct presidential elections.
So, the government caved to the main demand of the protesters, to hold direct elections for president. That's all we've got time for this week. Next time, we learn about the unprecedented strike wave which subsequently swept the country, about the election which took place, and the attempts by the dictatorship to cling to power by the back door. And we talk about more recent Korean history and lessons for today. Our Patreon supporters can listen to part 2 early and without ads now. It's only because of support from you, our listeners, that we're able to spend time making these podcasts. And it does take a lot of time. We've been working on this one for over 3 years now. So if you appreciate our work, please do think about joining us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. In return for your support, you get early access to content, as well as ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, discounted merch, and more. If you aren't in a position to support us right now, that is totally fine. Please just tell your friends about this podcast and give us a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. As always, we've got sources, links to more info, transcripts, and more on the webpage for this episode. Link in the show notes. Big thanks to our Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible. Special thanks to Jameson D. Saltzman, Jazz Hands, Fernando Lopez Ojeda, and Jeremy Cusimano. We would also like to thank various other people for their assistance with these episodes. In particular, Hwang Jeongeun and Steven of the International Strategy Center, Kwon Beomchul, Angela Lee, Kap Su Seol, and Hwang Yi-ra. On a personal note, I'd also like to thank my friend Loren Goldner, whose writings first got me interested in Korean history, and some of which we've used as sources for these episodes. Loren passed away in April 2024. He's sorely missed. Theme music for this episode was Marching for the Beloved, about the Gwangju Uprising, by Baek Ki-won, Hwang Sok-young, and Kim Jong-ryul. Link to stream it in the show notes. This episode was edited by Jesse French. Finally, thanks to you for listening. Catch you next time.